Hi, my name is Brittany. I typically do weekly vlogs as a school counselor, but I thought that I would switch it up this week and share my story of my journey to motherhood in honor of Mother's Day. So if you are new here, hi, welcome, thanks for being here. If you are not new here, hi, welcome back. This video is going to be a little long, so grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's get to it. So my husband Bryson and we were married in February of 2012. I was 21, he was 28, and before getting married we had decided that we wanted to wait a little bit to start our family, so I was on birth control. I was still going to school, I was still getting my undergrad, and so we just kind of decided to not start trying for a family right off the bat. It was 9-ish months later, like sometime around October in 2012, that I was like, okay, I think I want to start trying for a family, because I had heard that, sorry, that's my gray cat. I had heard that it could take like up to a year for birth control to completely get out of your system. And so we got off birth control and we didn't really try anything. And around the same time, my older sister also got off of birth control. And we would kind of talk like, oh, like it would be so much fun to be pregnant together, and just kind of dream together. And it was, I think, 2 years later that my sister ended up getting pregnant and having her first baby. And I remember driving to the hospital and visiting my sister and holding her sweet baby and realizing it had been almost 3 years since I'd been off birth control at this point, and going, okay, something might be wrong. It might be time to talk to the doctor. So I made an appointment with an OB who was in my health insurance network. At this point in time, Bryson and I were paying for our health insurance out of pocket, so I had very few options as to who could be my OB. So it was like, gosh, I want to say like 3 or 4 months later that I was finally able to get in and meet with my new OB. And we were just kind of talking, and she's like, oh, well, you're only 24, you're really young. Let's just make sure that you're ovulating. And so she put me on Clomid. I hated Clomid. I hated Clomid. My body reacted to it. Like everything was swollen. I hurt. I was emotional. I gained weight like crazy. And I didn't know that for Clomid you were supposed to do it every single month consistently. My doctor just kind of was like, oh yeah, take it, we'll see what happens. And I hated the side effects. And I was like, I have tests next month to like finish my degree. I can't take this when I'm going to be studying for finals. So then I didn't take it, and then I took it, and then I didn't take it, and then I took it, and I didn't take it. And it was just kind of off and on. I would sometimes barely ovulate on the Clomid. Sometimes I wouldn't at all. There was no pattern. There was really no consistency to it. And then more of my siblings were getting married, and they were starting to have kids. And so then I went back to my OB, and I was like, okay, I don't like the Clomid. It's not working. What else? So they had me try Femara. I liked Femara better, and I did it consistently for 3 months, and I didn't ovulate any of those 3 months. And my siblings were just, it felt like there were pregnancy announcements every 6 to 9 months. And I was not a pleasant person to be around at this time. I was so excited for my siblings, so incredibly excited. I was happy for them, but I was devastated every time there was a pregnancy announcement and it wasn't mine. I had a really, really hard time going to family events. I had a really hard time being around my sisters and their babies. Not that my sisters did anything wrong whatsoever. I was just having a hard time. And I loved each and every one of my nieces and nephews. And I was so grateful to have them in my life. But it was so hard. It got to the point where like I dreaded going to family events. And again, my sisters weren't doing anything wrong. They had every right to be as happy and excited as they were. And I was excited for them. I really was. I didn't know how to communicate what I was feeling to them though. So my response to it was I was happy for them and then I would withdraw. And that's one of the biggest things I regret through my whole journey is the way that I acted when other people would tell me that they were pregnant, family or friends. It was a really hard time. The Femara wasn't working. The Clomid wasn't working. My doctor put me on a chemical D&C pill essentially. It was awful. I was passing out at work. I was passing clots that were massive, probably TMI, but you know, this is what we're here for. I was passing clots that were like the size of my hand. I was getting migraines. And I was having the hardest time when my sisters continually, well, they weren't continually, but what it felt like my sisters were continually announcing their pregnancies. During this time, I had decided that if I couldn't have kids, I was going to go to school and get my master's. So I enrolled in a graduate program, and we didn't really try anything fertility-wise during that point in time with my OB. I didn't really trust my OB at that point. I didn't really have many options as far as insurance went. So we were trying different home remedies. Yeah, that was an adventure. And then I graduated with my master's in November of 2019. And I was already employed by my current school. And I was already receiving health insurance. And so I called my new OB, I think I called like at the end of October, and we scheduled an appointment for early January of 2020 with this new OB. We met, the new OB was like, okay, so how long have you been actively trying to get pregnant? And I was like, I've been off of birth control for 7 years at this point. We've done Clomid, we've done Femara, we did this chemical D&C pill. I've tried all these diets. I've tried your legs up on the wall, all these different things. And nothing has really worked. Hold on. So my new doctor said, okay, well, we're not even going to mess around with a lot of different things. They had me do blood tests, ultrasounds. I had to do like a sleep apnea test, just different things. Bryson had to do another analysis. And my blood work came back okay. Bryson's analysis was great. During the ultrasound, they found what looked like a mass in my uterus. And so my new OB was like, it looks like you have endometriosis. If that's what this is, I want you to contact this specific fertility specialist. Okay, done. We called the fertility specialist and we were able to go in and meet with her in March of 2020. See where I'm going with this. So we met with my fertility specialist the second week of March. And the shutdown hadn't happened, but COVID was very much a thing, and only 3 people were allowed in the room at a time. And so Bryson and I were in there with the ultrasound tech, and she's doing a vaginal ultrasound, and she just kind of stops and she's looking at her screen, and she's kind of moving things around, and she's like, huh. And it was taking a long time. And at this point, I'm getting pretty nervous. Bryson had to leave the room, and another doctor came in, and they were both like, And then they took me to do the dye test, the HSG test, and the water ultrasound. And Bryson was not allowed in that room with me because the ultrasound tech was there, the doctor was there, and then another doctor was in there. And the room was very small. And again, they were only allowing 3 extra people in the room, other than the patient at that point. So they did the water ultrasound. They did the dye test. They kept trying to shoot the dye up into my fallopian tubes multiple times. I just remember it hurting. And then finally they were like, okay, like, we'll leave, you can get dressed, and we'll meet you back in the room. Okay, great. So I get cleaned up and go meet Bryson in the hallway, and then we walk back to the room. And a different doctor, my doctor was at a different clinic that day. So the doctor that was at that clinic we were at came in, and they're like, so you have something called a unicornuate uterus with a non-communicative right horn. And I was like, I had no idea what that meant. So then they pulled up some pictures and they showed us, I can put a picture on the screen. But basically, your uterus is supposed to be whole. Mine was like this. Okay? And the mass that my second OB had seen wasn't actual endometriosis right here. It was a wall in my uterus, so none of the dye was able to go through. None of the dye was able to go through. It was really painful. And the fertility specialist told us, your doctor will be calling to go over the results, but you will most likely have to have surgery to have that part of your uterus removed. We were like, okay. Bryson and I drove home kind of in shock. It was hard to process. Later that evening, my doctor called and confirmed what the other one had said, that we needed to go ahead and get that half uterus taken out and removed, and that I would probably have to have some endometriosis cleaned out as well. My specialist recommended a surgeon. The next day, that office called. We had gotten the surgery scheduled for the last week in March, and then the shutdown happened and everything was just put on hold. We weren't able to do anything until I had this surgery. And we were finally able to get on the schedule for July 6th. Because while my surgery wasn't necessarily it wasn't an emergency surgery or anything life-threatening, it also wasn't considered cosmetic, and it was medically necessary. So we were able to go to the hospital, and they took out the right half of my uterus, the right fallopian tube, and they cleaned out all the endometriosis that was inside. When I went back to the surgeon's office the following week, just for my 1 week post-op checkup, that the right half was dead and it was just coming away in chunks, and it was just awful. And then the surgery was scheduled to be about 2.5 hours, and that was for them to remove that half of my uterus and clean out any endometriosis that they found. And it was all done laparoscopically it was like a robot assisted laparoscopic surgery. It took like 4.5 hours because the uterus was just coming out in pieces. But then also I had endometriosis in my uterus and my fallopian tubes and my ovaries and my pelvis outside of my fallopian tubes and outside of my uterus. And so the surgeon was like, you have stage 4 endometriosis. So you either need to be pregnant or you need to be on birth control because your endometriosis is so bad. And I was like, what do you mean stage 4? Your endometriosis, from what I was told, it follows like the stages of cancer. So like 4 is super severe versus like stage 1. And I said, okay. So we got on birth control, and then we just waited until early September. And then I went back into the fertility clinic, and we did another ultrasound, and my uterus had healed enough that we were able to move forward with the shots. Y'all, these shots were going to be the death of me. Excuse me. So we order the meds, we start preparing ourselves. My family had actually done a fundraiser for us to help gather money to pay for the IVF. A friend had set up a GoFundMe for us. So we were truly blessed in the sense that our IVF was paid for. So we paid for it all, and then we started doing the meds, we started doing the blood draws, we were doing the ultrasounds, and I had to go in every so often just to make sure my levels were rising like they're supposed to, and they weren't. So I'd go in, do a blood draw, and then my doctor would call me later that day and say, okay, your levels aren't where they need to be. We're going to up the dose to this. Waited a day, went back in, did another blood draw. My doctor would call, they're still not where they need to be. We're going to up the meds to this. So my meds actually came from 2 states away. So we were having to overnight a bunch of these medications so that I could be taking the correct dose. It was so hard. A lot of the meds have to be refrigerated, so they were coming in these big old insulated boxes with ice packs, and I had to be home to pick them up. Thankfully, my district had started the 2020-2021 school year online. We were virtual, which was how I was able to go to all these appointments and be at home for the meds to get her without it messing with my work schedule too much, because I was able to schedule the appointments around my Zoom lessons, or I would take my laptop with me to the clinic and I would either do my lesson in my car if I needed to, or they would let me stay in a room and do my lesson. So COVID was actually very helpful for my infertility journey. But it was just this constant, okay, your body's not responding, we're upping the meds. Your body's not responding, we're upping the meds. I went in for an ultrasound, and we were supposed to be checking my ovaries to see how many follicles were there for the egg retrieval. And I had to drive to a different clinic. My clinic was closed on the weekend, so we had to drive an hour and a half away. Bryson wasn't allowed in with me again, but the ultrasound tech was like, oh, this is a really good baseline. And I just remember looking at them and being like, the baseline, I was like, we're supposed to be doing the egg retrieval in like 2 days. And then the ultrasound tech was like, there's no follicles. There are no follicles whatsoever. And for like the hour and a half drive home, I sobbed. Things were not working. We'd been doing the shots for about 6 weeks at this point. I was tired. I was emotional. I was frustrated that things weren't working. And so later that day, my doctor called us, and they started talking to Bryson and I about egg donors. If we wanted to have an egg and sperm donor, we might want to start considering adoption. Or my doctor said that we could try like a Hail Mary pass. And Bryson and I were on the same page, and we were like, we want to try this Hail Mary. So my doctor got my meds up to 12 times the normal dosage, and we crossed our fingers. I was going in every other day, and my levels finally started to pick up. And after a week and a half, almost 2 weeks, there were 4 follicles. And my doctor called Bryson and I and they told us that we either needed to move forward with the egg retrieval now or risk losing 2 of the follicles. And so he said, we'll do the retrieval. So the next day we drove back down to a specific clinic, because out of the 3 clinics that this company has, only one does the egg retrievals. So we drove back down the hour and a half. We did the egg retrieval, and drove back home. And I was freaking out. I was so nervous. I was worried that it wasn't going to work, that none of the follicles, once fertilized, would turn into viable embryos. And it was like 2 days later, I think, we got a phone call saying that we had a viable embryo and that we were ready to do a fresh transfer. So we went down and we did the fresh transfer and came back home. I did my 2 princess days, and then we went, it was the week of Thanksgiving, because we went down south with Bryson's family for Thanksgiving that year. And like some of them were wanting to like go rock climbing and go hiking, and I was like, I'm not really allowed to at this point. And I didn't really feel very different than I did on the meds, but my body had responded so poorly to the meds. Like, I was getting headaches, I would be queasy off and on, that I was like, well, am I pregnant or am I just normal? So after Thanksgiving, we went back in and did the blood draw. And then that afternoon, I was home because I was still working from home. Bryson showed up from work about 3 hours early, and I just looked at him. And I knew that the office had called him and told him that it didn't take. I found out later Bryson had actually called the clinic. It's like, okay, if it's negative, you need to call me so I can be home for Brittany. And we actually found out about the failed conception 2 days before my 30th birthday. And I was a wreck. We were told to stop the meds cold turkey since we wouldn't be doing another implant for a while. In order to do the implants, you couldn't be exposed to COVID, and my school was going to be opening back up at the end of January, so I was going back mid-January. And I told my doctor, I was like, I'm in an elementary school, I'm going to be exposed. Like, I can't spend all this money for this now frozen transfer and have to keep postponing. So we decided to wait until the end of the school year to do the next implant, because the day we did the fresh transfer, we found out that the second follicle had fertilized and it was now a viable embryo. So we had that one frozen. So we stopped the meds and I got back on birth control. And we just kind of were in this limbo for a while. And then at the end of May, I started doing the shots again to prepare my body for the frozen implant. Celebrated my baby sister's wedding, and then the next week we went ahead and we did the frozen transfer. I did my princess days again, and then like 2 or 3 days after my princess days, we went to Hawaii for a week with our best friends. The goal was actually to go in March of 2020, but that obviously didn't happen. So we went to Hawaii, and the whole time we were like, okay, we're gonna pretend like I'm pregnant because we don't know. And the 10-day blood draw was during the middle of our trip, and we didn't know if we were pregnant or not, so we just pretended. Y'all, I got so sick. But as the week went on, I was getting more nauseous in the mornings. I was getting more tired. And I was like, well, it might just be like how every pregnancy is different. This just might be the way my body is reacting to the meds this time around. So we just pretended I was pregnant, but I was getting really queasy. I was getting really sick. Food stopped sounding great. So then we fly home, and we got home just right after the clinic would have closed. So it was like the first thing the next morning where I went in and I did the blood work. And then that evening we got a phone call. It was a Thursday. We got a phone call saying that the implant had been successful, and that after 9 years at this point, I was pregnant. And I just remember sitting on the floor and looking at Bryson, and he was crying, and I was a mess. I was sobbing. And it was like finally my turn. And I called my mom, I called my dad, I called my grandma, I called all my siblings. Bryson called his parents and his siblings, because everybody knew that like this is what we were waiting on. But I was finally pregnant, and I was about 7 weeks at that point. And then we went and we had weekly appointments with the clinic. And then we graduated from the fertility clinic at 10 weeks pregnant. And I got so sick, you guys. I was so sick. I lost, I think, like 25 pounds my whole pregnancy, because I either wasn't hungry or I was puking until it was like 9 o'clock at night. 9 o'clock at night would hit, and I was like, I want French fries and hamburger. But because of my half uterus, I was high risk my entire pregnancy. And then we found out around 18 weeks that the baby was a girl. And so we knew that the name was Rayleigh, and we did a gender reveal for the family, and just soaked up every minute of being pregnant. I was exhausted all the time. It was a hard pregnancy, but it was so worth it. And it was finally my turn, and I was just thrilled. We knew that I would have to have a C-section since day one. So we got that scheduled, and then in January of 2022, I was in doing what was it? Oh, I think it was just like a routine ultrasound. And Rayleigh was measuring in the 3rd percentile. So they sent me over to do the stress tests, and my uterus wasn't like contracting and releasing. It was just tight. So on the stress test machines, it looked like I was having this like permanent contraction. And so they said, well, you'll probably have to have the baby slightly earlier than we had planned. My OB knew that we weren't going to make it full term just because of my uterus. And so the OBGYN center had me come and get steroids, a steroid shot to help Rayleigh's lungs develop so we could hopefully have a minimal NICU stay. And then I went in every other week for the rest of January and did stress tests just to make sure Rayleigh was okay. And then at the beginning of February, I was going in weekly for my weekly appointments and for weekly stress tests. And during one of the stress tests, they were like, your uterus is too tight, it's too tense, you're not going to make it to this due date, you need to have her earlier. So my OBGYN called me and she said, well, let me think, it was February 15th. And she said, you can have her on the 17th or you can have her on the 19th. Those are the next 2 days I have available. And I said, well, the 17th is my 10-year wedding anniversary and I would like to not be in the hospital for it. So we rescheduled the C-section for February 19th. And Bryson and I went and celebrated our 10th anniversary 2 days before. And it was really surreal just knowing that this was our last anniversary before we were finally a family of 3. And then on a Saturday, February 19th, we woke up at about 4:30 in the morning, packed up, got to the hospital by 6. And we were taken into labor and delivery. They got me hooked up and then we just kind of waited. And then they wheeled me into the operating room and we started the procedure. I was pretty cold. And when they pulled Rayleigh out, she made like a goat noise for starters. Like she made a goat noise and that was the only thing we heard from her for 3 days. But she did her scream and then they took her over to the table because there was meconium in the amniotic sac. So they took her over to the warming table. They got her cleaned up and they got her bundled up. And my OB was like, so everybody, this is what a half uterus looks like. And she's like showing it to people. Other doctors came in the room at this point, nurses, people who wanted to know what a half uterus looked like. They all came in. I should have charged them admission. Would have paid my hospital bills. And then they finally got me stitched up and Rayleigh was on this warming table and there were 2 nurses that were just like, okay, like, is she going to be okay? Do we need to get her into the NICU? And she didn't have to go into the NICU. They moved me to the labor and delivery bed off of the operating table. And as they started to wheel me out, they brought me Rayleigh and they gave her to me. And I didn't get to do skin to skin, but I got to hold my baby. And I got to meet her for the first time and I wasn't going to cry. And I remember looking at her and looking at Bryson and just feeling this insane amount of peace. And like we had finally done it. And I didn't want to let her go. But they took me back to the labor and delivery room. And they had to like check me out for a little bit. And so then I got to see Bryson hold Rayleigh for the first time. And just seeing him just crying and looking at her and just hearing him tell her how much he loved her already was a moment I will never forget. so yeah, that's how I became a mom. And now we're doing the whole thing all over again to try to have another one. So more IVF. But so that's it. That's my birth story, my journey to motherhood. Thanks for watching if you made it this far. And I will see you all next week.